Welcome back everyone, and thank you for joining me today. If you love coins, hidden treasures, unbelievable stories, and the idea that something small in your pocket could secretly be worth more than anyone ever imagined, then you are absolutely in the right place. Today we are diving into one of the most fascinating, controversial, and mind-bending topics in modern American coin collecting, the Liberty 1 cent 1976 Lincoln penny, a coin with a face value of just 1 cent, yet surrounded by legends, theories, documented errors, minting mysteries, and extraordinary possibilities that have pushed some estimates and stories as high as $320.5 million. This is not just a story about copper and zinc, this is a story about history, mistakes, chance, rarity, human error, and how tiny details can completely rewrite the value of an ordinary object. When people hear the words 1976 Lincoln penny, most immediately think of a common coin, something made in enormous quantities during America's bicentennial era. After all, 1976 was a proud year in United States history, celebrating 200 years since independence, and the nation was buzzing with patriotic spirit. The Lincoln cent itself did not carry a special bicentennial design that year like the quarter, half dollar, and dollar did, but millions upon millions of pennies rolled off the presses at the Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco mints. To the average person, this would suggest nothing special at all. But coin collecting has never been about averages. It has always been about the exceptions, the accidents, the unexpected variations, and the tiny anomalies that slip past human eyes and machines. The Liberty 1 cent of 1976 carries the iconic Lincoln portrait on the obverse, a design first introduced in 1909 to honor the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth. By 1976, this design had already become one of the most recognizable images in American currency. On the re. Now we are talking about the Liberty 1 cent 1976 D Lincoln penny from the United States, a coin that millions of people have held, spent, ignored, or tucked away without a second thought, yet one that has become the center of intense speculation, deep research, documented minting anomalies, and extraordinary possibilities that separate its face value from an astonishing estimated worth of $319.5 million. This is a story about history, human error, rare chance, and how the smallest details can change everything. At first glance, the 1976 D Lincoln cent seems completely ordinary. It carries the familiar portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the front, a design created by Victor David Brenner and first introduced in 1909. By the time 1976 arrived, this design had already been part of American life for nearly 7 decades. On the reverse, the Lincoln Memorial stands as a symbol of unity and remembrance, a design that had been in use since 1959. The mint mark D, placed below the date, tells us that the coin was struck at the Denver Mint. Nothing about this coin's appearance suggests extraordinary value. And yet, in the world of coin collecting, appearance alone is never the full story. The year 1976 was a powerful moment in American history. The nation was celebrating its bicentennial, marking 200 years since the Declaration of Independence. While quarters, half dollars, and dollar coins received special bicentennial designs, the Lincoln cent remained visually unchanged. This has led many people to believe that 1976 pennies are unimportant or common. In terms of mintage numbers, that is partly true. Hundreds of millions of Lincoln cents were produced that year at the Denver Mint. But rarity is not always about how many coins were made. Sometimes, rarity is about how many were made incorrectly, how many survived, and how many were never noticed until decades later. To understand how a 1976 D Lincoln penny could be valued so far be. Many of us toss them into jars, leave them in drawers, or ignore them on the ground. But today's story is about a Liberty 1 cent 1980 Lincoln penny from the United States that challenges everything we think we know about value. This is a story about how a coin with a face value of just 1 cent can be discussed in connection with an astonishing figure of $313 million, not because of fantasy, but because of rare errors, mistakes, mint mark anomalies, and extraordinary possibilities hidden within its metal. The Lincoln cent has been part of American life for generations. Introduced in 1909 to honor the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth, it became the first circulating U.S. coin to feature a real historical figure. By 1980, the design was deeply familiar. Lincoln's profile faced right on the front, with the words "In God We Trust" above his head, "Liberty" to the left, and the date below. On the reverse, the Lincoln Memorial stood proudly, with the tiny seated statue of Lincoln visible between the columns. Millions of Americans had handled these coins countless times, rarely pausing to look closely. Yet in numismatics, close inspection is everything. The year 1980 sits at an interesting crossroads in U.S. coinage history. It was one of the final years before a major composition change. Up until 1982, Lincoln cents were made primarily of copper, a metal that already carried intrinsic value. Rising copper prices were creating economic pressure on the U.S. Mint, forcing discussions about cheaper alternatives. During this period, mints were producing enormous quantities of cents under intense demand. High-speed production, aging equipment, and human oversight combined to create the perfect environment for mistakes. When the Denver Mint and the Philadelphia Mint struck 1980 Lincoln cents, they were operating massive presses capable of striking hundreds of coins per minute. Dies were used repeatedly until they wore down, cracked, or F. Dears Are Today's next journey is about a coin that almost everyone has seen, many have spent, and countless people have ignored without a second thought. We are talking about the Liberty 1 cent 1981 Lincoln penny from the United States, a small copper coin with a face value of just 1 cent, yet a coin surrounded by stories, research, and extraordinary possibilities that have pushed its imagined worth into the astonishing range of $312.5 million. This is not a tale meant to shock for entertainment alone, but a deep exploration of how errors, mistakes, mint mark anomalies, and rare circumstances can transform something ordinary into something extraordinary. The Lincoln cent is one of the most recognizable coins in American history. Introduced in 1909 to commemorate the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, it marked a turning point in U.S. coinage by featuring a real historical figure for the first time. By 1981, the design was familiar to nearly everyone. Lincoln's calm profile faced right on the front, surrounded by the words "In God We Trust," "Liberty," and the year of minting. On the reverse, the Lincoln Memorial stood with quiet dignity, its columns framing the small seated statue of Lincoln. These pennies passed through millions of hands every day, often without being noticed, yet each one carried the marks of its creation. The year 1981 itself is especially important when discussing Lincoln cents. It was one of the final years before a major change in composition altered the penny forever. Rising copper prices were making the production of copper-based cents increasingly expensive. Inside the U.S. Mint, discussions were ongoing about alternative metals, cost-saving measures, and experimental approaches. While the official change to copper-plated zinc would not occur until 1982, the pressure and preparation leading up to that change created conditions where mistakes, tests, and unexpected outcomes were more likely to occur. Now, we are diving deep into one of the most fascinating, controversial, and talked about modern U.S. coins of all time, a humble-looking penny that on the surface seems ordinary, but beneath that copper glow hides stories of errors, mysteries, minting anomalies, and extraordinary possibilities. This is the story of the Liberty 1 cent 1981 D Lincoln penny, a coin with a face value of just 1 cent, yet surrounded by legends and theoretical scenarios that push its potential worth into the astonishing realm of hundreds of millions of dollars. At first glance, the 1981 D Lincoln cent looks like any other penny most Americans have seen thousands of times. Abraham Lincoln's familiar portrait faces right, his calm expression frozen in time, representing unity, endurance, and the long-standing values of the United States. The reverse, depending on the variety, carries the Lincoln Memorial design that defined the era. Millions upon millions of these coins were struck at the Denver Mint in 1981, intended for everyday use, passed from hand to hand, dropped into jars, lost under couch cushions, or worn smooth by decades of circulation. And yet, Within this massive production lies the foundation for one of the most intriguing discussions in modern numismatics. The year 1981 was a critical transitional period for U.S. coinage. Rising copper prices, changing minting technologies, and evolving quality control systems created an environment where unusual mistakes could slip through unnoticed. The U.S. Mint was under constant pressure to balance cost, speed, and accuracy, and during such times, anomalies are more likely to occur. For collectors, these anomalies are not flaws but fingerprints of history, proof that even the most advanced systems are operated by humans and machines capable of imperfection. The Denver Mint, identified by the small d mint mark beneath the date, was a powerhouse facility, producing enormous quantities of cents to meet the nation's demand. In 1981 Al. Now dears, we are diving deep into one of the most talked about, debated, and endlessly fascinating coins in modern American numismatic history. This is the story of the Liberty 1 cent 1982 Lincoln penny, a coin with a face value of just 1 cent, yet surrounded by extraordinary possibilities that stretch its theoretical worth to an unbelievable $309.6 million. At first glance, the 1982 Lincoln cent looks ordinary. It carries the familiar portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the front, a design that has been part of American daily life for over a century. On the reverse, depending on the variety, appears the Lincoln Memorial, a symbol of national unity and historical memory. Millions of these pennies passed through the hands of Americans during the early 1980s, used to buy candy, make exact change, or tossed into jars without a second thought. And yet, 1982 was not an ordinary year for the U.S. Mint, and that is where this story truly begins. The year 1982 stands as one of the most important transition points in the history of U.S. coinage. Rising metal prices, especially copper, were creating serious financial pressure on the mint. The cost of producing a penny was approaching, and in some cases exceeding, its face value. This forced the mint to make a historic decision that would forever change the composition of the Lincoln cent. For most of its history, the penny had been made of 95% copper. But in 1982, the mint began transitioning to a new composition of zinc coated with a thin layer of copper. This transition did not happen overnight, and it did not happen cleanly. Instead, 1982 became a year of overlap, experimentation, and confusion. Both copper and zinc planchets were used. Different mints produced different varieties. Dies were changed, reused, and modified. Quality control systems were under immense strain. This perfect storm created an environment where errors, mistakes, and anomalies could slip through unnoticed. The Liberty 1 cent 198. My great viewers, now we are going to explore the fascinating, complex, and endlessly debated world of the Liberty 1 cent 1983 Lincoln penny, a coin that on its face is worth just 1 cent, but under the lens of history, minting anomalies, errors, and theoretical possibilities could command a value that stretches into an almost unimaginable $307.5 million. This is a story of mistakes, mysteries, and potential beyond what anyone could imagine when they first glanced at this humble coin. At first glance, the 1983 Lincoln cent looks familiar, even comforting. Abraham Lincoln's portrait dominates the obverse, calm, dignified, and symbolic of America's enduring values. Surrounding his profile are the words "In God We Trust" above, "Liberty" to the left, and the date at the bottom. On the reverse sits the Lincoln Memorial, its columns etched with detail, and if you look closely, the tiny seated statue of Lincoln inside. To the casual observer, it is a standard penny, one among millions, produced to facilitate everyday transactions. But the 1983 Lincoln cent exists within a fascinating period of change and possibility, a time when production methods, composition shifts, and human error combined to create an environment where rare and valuable anomalies could occur. The year 1983 came at a time when the United States Mint was navigating complex economic pressures. The cost of copper had risen dramatically, and producing a coin out of nearly pure copper was becoming increasingly expensive. In response, the Mint had recently completed the transition to the modern copper-plated zinc composition, a change that began officially in 1982. However, this transition was not smooth, and during the early years of this new composition, irregularities in planchets, striking pressures, and die preparations created room for potential mistakes. These errors, while rare, have become the foundation for legendary stories about pennies whose value extends far beyond face value.